Okay. So this is the tutorial to kind of help you and therefore our entire team have a universal art style, and part of that will be based around the sculpting techniques that we use when making the high poly models. Uh, I realise I haven't introduced myself yet. My name is Elmo. You may know me from such times as team meetings and Discord. So, this is a model that I made in Blender quickly. Um, I mean, obviously you'll be using Maya, but the principles are basically the same. I made sure to give the model a name which we could use later when we bake by mesh name. This can be important for scenes which have a lot of components. As you can see, this model is unbeveled around the edges, and it'll become clear why we've done that, but we will be beveling it later to produce a cleaner bake altogether. So let's jump back into ZBrush, and I've dynameshed this. So it's got about, oh, where's it? So it's got about 900,000 polys, which may be too many, but it should be good enough. And to start with, I would say what you've got to do is you've got to break up the edges of the object itself. This is especially important for stone, which this kind of obelisk thing is going to be made out of. The top's going to be like gold, just to give a bit of texture variation. And we're also going to add some runic elements, like around here. But for all of this, we've got to first break down the obvious outlines of the object. And to do that, we're going to do B, T, D. And this is the trim dynamic brush. In terms of strength, 25 should be okay. Let's try 43. Okay, yeah, so this is plenty. And we just want to go around. You don't really have to be too careful with this. It's a good idea to decrease and increase brush sizes as you go, just to give a bit of variation to the texture itself. And obviously, because this is a quick tutorial, I'm going to be doing this extra quick to how I would usually. So just really fast, going around, kind of just diminishing the obvious shape of the object. And if you fuck up a little bit like I just did there, and you put a little dink here, it's probably okay. That one's a bit severe, but as you can see, the kind of like messy lines and grooves you get from doing this will like contribute to a really nice detailed normal map, which will be great for texturing later when we come to baking and substance painter as well. So for areas like this, you can see it's a bit, you can get like a bit of the original line there. You can just use shift to smooth that down and just kind of messy it up like that. And it basically, unless you were looking really closely, you wouldn't be able to see it was there in video games. So, there is a pretty large margin for error when you're using like a quite a stylized art style for, relatively simple props. For things like characters, like the NPCs and the Wendigos, obviously it's worth taking a lot more time, especially with kind of the bone structure of the Wendigo, and basically everything. But as I said before, it's a quick tutorial, so I'm really not aiming to make my masterpiece here. Kind of just aiming to get this done, and then well, hopefully it'll be you guys making the masterpieces, eh? Cool. For God's sake, sorry about this. The controls for ZBrush are very different to Blender, and they're pretty fiddly, to be honest. And you may actually wonder why I'm bothering to do this bit here, as well, the player's not really going to see the bottom section, are they? Well, that might be true, but since we're aiming to make, modular asset kits, it's a good idea just to have this here in case we want to have, one of these pillars which is like fallen over, so the player will be able to see the bottom. Now moving on to the top, for God's sake. There we are. Again, just using the same brush techniques with the trim dynamic, just going over it like such. And there's that messy bit that I made earlier. Just kind of draw over it, real easy, no fuss. Obviously with all art, it's important to have some reference while you work, even with, stylized art, which doesn't really look anything like real life, but some reference can really just help you to kind of understand more about the object you're working with. And just get a little pick of my reference, see how the stone kind of like breaks away, and then just translating that into like a more stylized aesthetic. And you can see with that done already, it's looking a lot better than the low poly we had before. So now I'm going to use B, H, and this brings up the H polish brush, which is good for adding kind of like hard surface texture, if that makes sense. So it's good for things like stone and metal, and let's see how this is going. Okay, so that's a bit intense. Let's just turn it down to 25, and you can use the Alt key to make the brush swap between adding and subtracting. And so by doing this, we can kind of create just a nice little grooves on the surface, just a bit more for the baking to pick up in Substance Painter. Give us a bit more like texture detail. Brilliant. So as before, just being quite rough, fairly heavy-handed, maybe worrying a bit more than I am about, the final outcome. But as they say, speed has a value all of itself. Okay, there we are. And do the bottom and the top. Just really quickly kind of blocking this in. Always try to randomize kind of strokes. We really want to get a sense of like a non-uniform material. That will help just add to the variation in the world. It'll make it harder to recognize when we've used the same asset, as the textures will look different from each side. That's that bit done. Controls are still trying to mess with me, and now just do it up here as well. Oh, silly me. I've forgotten to do this bit. What I really like to do is in these corners you can kind of create these bits, these nice little lines where all the bits kind of meet all your brush strokes, and this just helps give it like a really nice texture. Let's go back to H polish then. Finish off this. And this bit. Oopsie daisy. So, turn around like that. See, with a very small amount of work, we've managed to create something that looks far better than it did originally. If we were doing this for an actual asset, it's likely I'd have the bottom section, middle section, and the top section as different objects, just so I could texture in these bits here, so I could add some surface detail to these bits and underneath here, and also, then we could use it modularly to make new assets. But like I said, for this tutorial, we're just gonna be going simple. So this is looking nice, but let's add some runes for this. And for this, I'm going to use the third brush in the arsenal, which is BTD. Oops, sorry, no, it's BCB. It's the clay build-up brush. And with this, you want to set it to sub, or you can do. It depends what you're using it for, I suppose. And for this, we're just gonna turn the intensity down a bit. 15 should be alright. Just kind of grazing in some marks here, just to make it a bit less harsh on the eye. Just smooth it down and build it up. Build it up like such. Nice. Using alphas for things like that is also a great idea and very time saving, but yeah, because you can use them again and again, but for this, the clay build-up brush will work fine. And it looks a bit pixely when you're this close up, but really none of that detail is going to show up in the bake, which is the part which actually matters. And I doubt the player will notice anyway, seeing as our game is going to be fairly zoomed out for the whole experience. You're not really going to be getting this close to the objects, unless of course we have them in loading screens like Skyrim style, which would be great, but you know, stretch colors and all. Let's do the last side. Nice. That looks good. Well, good enough, I'd say. Oopsie daisy. Okay, so there we have our obelisk with some runes on the top, on the gold cap, and it looks fine, but we gotta... Sorry, this mouse is really a pain. Oh, jeez. We gotta remember, this has been outside for like a long time, so maybe we want to add some cracks on the surface, which would help give the, you know, the impression that it's been out there for a long time. And again, we'd use the clay build-up brush, kind of just going along like such, just carving these marks in. Maybe we want this to go like down here a bit. Why not? And then again, just smooth that to help keep with the stylized aesthetic. Make that a little sharper. Okay, so that could definitely be way more jagged, but for now, I'd say that's good enough. Let's have one here. Start off small and getting a bit bigger as we go. Like, make it really messy, and then stopping there. And then just make it a little deeper, building it up as we go. There we are. Smoothing it all off. I know I've said this a lot, but I would really emphasize spending a lot more time on this than I'm doing. Sure. Let's add one more. Just up here. And I know I'm working on, you know, a structure, something non-organic, but the same or similar principles can also be applied to, you know, characters, leather, anything you might need to make. It's all just, you know, making sure we have a cohesive style throughout the project. Cool. So this is done, he says. And let's just quickly export this. HP. Yeah, that would do. So now let's move over to Substance Painter, which I have handy here. File, new, and we want to get the, excuse me, world building. A quick note on low poly models. Although this is in Blender, the same principles apply in Maya. As you can see, these edges are quite sharp in its current state, which will look, it would just look odd when we try and bake it with the mesh that we have at the moment, the nice smoothed high poly we made. So to resolve this problem, we're just going to add some bevels in, here. We want to add a bevel to all the bits that are going to be soft, so all of the nice smooth edges on the high poly, all of those bits. Here we go, let's just add some bevels then. Nothing, doesn't need to be too extreme, that will probably be fine. You also want to make sure it's smooth, which is good for baking, and then we'll just make the edges which are over a 90 degree angle or under, So I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Maths was never my strong point. Edges that are like this, basically, that need to be sharp, we're going to keep those sharp, like so, while all the other edges, the ones which are going to be soft on the model itself, on the high poly model, so we've got the hard edges here, and then the soft edges, all the rest of it, yeah, we need to keep them soft. So yeah, that sums it up. Now let's move over to Substance Painter and get to baking. A quick note on UVs. When you go to unwrapping, it's okay to have a bit of stretching textile density, like I have here and here, mainly because the stylized kind of texture setup means that that will be hardly noticeable, as there won't be too many fine details to get stretched. When you do have to put a seam down the side of an object, like here, kind of just try to choose the side which you think will be, least visible. Obviously, putting seams in the joining bits is a good idea, because these are going to be hard edges anyway. Oh, fuck me. God damn these camera controls today. So these will be hardly noticeable. With this UV sheet here, there's a lot of wasted space. If you can pack some smaller assets kind of just into this area, that'd be great. So just anything you want. Maybe we could have a tiny little baby obelisk next to this one. Just whack it in the extra UV space. If you're doing like writing and like marks or just detailed fine marks, you basically want to have the textile density as stable and unstretched as possible, otherwise it will make a weird effect. Yeah, that pretty much wraps it up for UV optimization. Okay, so here we are in Substance Painter with our hard edges, with our hard edges, soft edges, amazingly laid out UVs, and of course correct material names, which, although not really useful now, will be especially relevant when we come to actually organizing the the Unity folders. We don't want a million materials named mat underscore 0.1. It would just be a nightmare. So if we do that now, it will just save us so much time in the long run. We should probably kind of designate an actual file naming structure, but for now, this will do. So we've got our output size. Let's just set it to 1K, just to test that everything's working. We have our high poly plugged in here. I've turned off average normals, ignore backfaces, and diffusion, just because I don't really think they add anything. And these two especially can kind of fuck with the results. So let's just give that a test bake and see how it turns out. Okay, that was quick. So here we go. Little bit of errors there. So I guess we have to turn up the distance, the bake distance. If you get things like that, it might be worth turning up bake distance. Sometimes it can be a different issue, which can require a baking cage. That's kind of a complicated topic, so if it comes up, I can get into that. Okay, so got rid of those elements. That looks good, and as you can see, all of the details we sculpted in are pretty much present here. It's fairly hard to distinguish from the high poly we made, which is exactly what we're going for. Just to help us see it a bit better, I'm going to change from Panorama to Studio 3, just because it gives some good lighting, which I feel makes it a lot easier to see things. Okay, so now that we have that, we're going to bake at 4K with anti-aliasing at ×4, and this will help give the cleanest bake possible. The texture itself, we're still going to be exporting at 1K, so it won't actually be that taxing on the system, but the base that we'll be working off for that 1K texture will be higher, just leading to an all-round cleaner, better texture. So with the normal done, baked at 4K with subsampling ×4 on the anti-aliasing, I'm going to bake the other maps. Now we don't need an ID, we just need well-spaced normals, ambient occlusion, curvature, position, and thickness, and we want to turn the anti-aliasing off entirely, because that will just take forever baking all these things with anti-aliasing. Again, we want to use 4K. Hey, so welcome back. All of our maps are baked, and now it's time to actually start texturing. So first of all, let's just delete the default paint layer if it will let me. Oh, oh, there we go. And now let's make a folder. Just call this obelisk style. If I could spell obelisk stylized stone. Brilliant. To start off, we want to add a fill layer inside here, and this is just going to act as the very base for our texture. We want to turn off height and normal. We want this to be quite rough. It is stone after all, and just use the light to kind of gauge how rough it is. Just pivot it around, see how much reflection you can see. In terms of color, let's go for kind of like a darky blue. I think that looks okay. Now, what we want to do first is we want to add some variation to the color. This will just help to create a texture which just looks, a little bit more interesting. And you may have wondered why I've left the metallic on. This is just to make sure that it's always set to 0 metallic rather than 1 metallic, which would make the whole thing, appear metally. So we're just going to keep that at 0. It's only really necessary to set the roughness and the metallic on the base layer, and we don't really need it for the color variation, unless when we wanted it to be of different roughness or of different metallic values, but we'll change those later on. So in here, we want to right click and add a fill layer to this black mask on the base color. Sorry, I actually didn't go through that. For the base, for the second color, base variation, or just base V we'll call it, you want to add a black mask so it's not visible, and then to that black mask you want to add a fill layer. To that fill layer we want to go down to the procedurals and let's just add clouds. Like really you can use whatever mask, whatever procedural suits the style of texture you're creating. That's completely up to you. Just as long as it, fits with real world examples and looks good, which is the more important part. Because we're using a stylized aesthetic, it's not really as important for us to, make things that look like their real world counterparts, but more to make things which feel like their real world counterparts without sounding like too much of an artiste. Okay, so if you alt click on the mask, you'll be able to see which areas it's affecting, which is currently like most. I just want to turn this down, turn the contrast up a little bit. Give it some random, and that works fine. And then to here, I usually like to make the variation a little darker, and as you can see, it's just kind of just adding in. It's not too visible, but if you turn it off and on, you can see it makes a difference. Let's turn this up a little bit because it's not really giving us what we want. Turn the contrast down. It's all just about playing with these values until you find something that looks good to you. Now that kind of looks fine. So I'm going to copy this mask, and then I'm also going to duplicate this base layer. Oopsie daisy. If you find some stuff happens like this, that's probably because you accidentally pressed the C key. You could just press the M key to go back to the default view. Now in this is going to be rough V. And this layer is just going to be giving us a bit of roughness variation, just, again, to help break up the texture. So instead of making this mask again, since we want to use the same pattern, let's just copy and paste it in here. Do remember it will have the same appearance as the first one, so just smash that random button a couple of times. Now, we want this one to be slightly more rough. Maybe it's giving the illusion of some wet patches or something. It's actually kind of hard to see. No, you can see it, but for this we also maybe want to turn up the contrast a bit, just to make sure those kind of patches of shininess are limited to a few spaces. You can make it out there like such, and this will make more of a difference when we add dynamic lighting to the game, where the light, shines and changes from different angles, and then you'll be able to see these roughness bits. It'll really help pick them out. So this kind of is the base layer. Now what we want to do is we want to highlight the edges and the cavities. And to do this, another fill layer. This is going to be cav, To this, we're going to add a black mask and, you guessed it, another fill layer. And inside here, we're going to go into our projects tab here, and we're going to choose the curvature. Now, if we alt-click on the curvature mask, you'll see it's targeting the edges, which is kind of what we want, but we want to be targeting the cavities. So let's right-click on that, invert mask, and now you can see the cavities are the whitest part and the inside bit, but not quite what we want. So let's just go into the Levels tab and turn this down until we get something like that, where it's targeting the bits which go in a lot. That looks good. And then, as you can see, it's still the color. We'll just set this as black. Maybe not black. Let's just steal the base color, turn it down a bunch, like that. And then we want to turn the roughness down quite a lot as well, just because things tend to look darker when they're rougher. I find this just helps create an interesting effect. If you're getting some kind of like a bit jagged bits like this, you can always add a filter and a blur, like so. Which just helps to, oopsie daisy, easy there, just helps to break it up a little bit, make it look a little less angular. So that looks okay. And next we want to do the edges. Another cavity, another layer, another fill layer, another black mask, another fill layer. Again, choose cavities, targeting these parts, and then we want to add another fill layer. Oh, sorry, a levels slider. Scroll until you can barely see. Yeah, so that's kind of what we're looking for. Okay, and then again, steal the base color, and we'll just turn this up to like that. Turn these off. It kind of gives a good impression when the edges are quite rough. I find that looks pretty good. You know, just play with it until you're happy with how the texture looks. I think this is a bit too obvious. Turn it down a little, like that. Okay, that's nice. I kind of like this kind of dusty effect. Let's actually turn this up a little bit. It's kind of a bit too obvious there. Cool. So as you can see, with only 5 layers, we've managed to create this interesting and simple texture which, you know, captures the feeling of the object without really being too taxing on the system. Now, it's worth saving these when you make as a smart material, just so you don't have to go through the same process all over, and you can just drag it onto whatever asset you're making. For the Wendigo horns especially, I think this would look really nice if, you know, you kind of get that contrast between the light areas and the dark areas. It would just look really nice on the skeletons, and you could sculpt in lots of like grain or stuff. Yeah, like, you know, with nice obvious strokes. Just make it look great. So now we're going to do the golden top. Now let's just select it in the UV view, the bit we want. It's just the top. Turn off all the bits, just because we don't need them right now. For this one, we want it to be metallic. We want it to be quite shiny. Now let's see if we can actually get a gold color. Maybe we want something bronzish instead. Oh! Okay, yeah, that looks right. Turn it up a little bit. Oh, no. Look better like that. There we are. Now, some variation to the texture, to the color. There we go. It's interesting that when you're doing it, it doesn't look like much is changing, but when you turn off the previous layers and toggle them back on, you can kind of see the difference it makes, which is quite a bit. For the roughness, do we want this to be shinier or darker, or less shiny? Maybe it's worth going less shiny on these bits, just to kind of offset that natural shininess the metal has, and just, so you can see it quite nicely there. Some bits much brighter than others, just kind of making it seem like it's been outside for however long, 100 years. And for the cavities, same principle, exact same technique we used previously. Just get this, turn it down. Having the roughness contrast with the metal makes it kind of seem like dirt built up in there. And then for the edges, same principle as before. As you've probably worked out by now, this kind of pipeline for making materials kind of just relies on, the same principles throughout. And there we go. I don't think that needs much work, to be honest. That looks quite good. Stone itself could be darker, I think, but that's good enough for now. Now the question is, how do we properly export this to Unity? Just go File, Export Textures, and in here we're going to use, where is it now? Unity Metallic Standard. Of course, choose a good folder. So for me, it's going to be UniWork, World Building, Tutorial. That's fine. Now, the problem is when you export as Metallic Standard, you'll notice there is no ambient occlusion channel, which for us makes up, a considerable amount of the detail. But luckily, I know a pretty cheeky way of actually cheating it. So what we do, make a fill layer, add a black mask, add a fill layer to that. In here, first thing we do actually is turn off the ambient occlusion, as we won't actually be exporting it, and then instead we drag the ambient occlusion into this fill layer, and then just invert it like so. And this way it still works to pick up those dark areas, around the bottom, around the top, those dark areas, but it just adds it to the base color layer, so we don't actually have to export an AO channel when we export textures. Oh, for fuck's sake. Okay, it reset all the things that I told it to do. Tutorial, in there. Here we go. Now, Unity Universal Render Pipeline Metallic Standard. Excellent. And that's all. So I'll see you in Unity very briefly, and we'll finally get to the last part of the tutorial. Okay, so here we are in Unity. I've made a little folder in the test models tut folder. Obviously, I won't actually save this to the project. This is just, to show how we set it up in Unity, because for some reason all the game engines are different, and honestly, setting up your material tends to be overly complicated. I don't know why, it's just annoying. So let's drag in the textures we exported, the albedo, transparency, the metallic smoothness, and the normal. And you also want to add the actual mesh itself. My mesh is literally called, hold on a fucking minute. Oh, okay. For some reason I thought it was pointing sideways because of in the icon. This is way too large. Let's turn this down to 20, 20, 20. How does that look? Much better. And so we just want to right click, create material, there we go. And let's just call this, if I can change its name, tut obelisk mat. Again, we should probably work on finalizing a folder structure just to avoid any confusion in future. And so now we have our material. We want to drag in the albedo, drag in the metallic smoothness into here, and for the source, for the smoothness, we want to set this to metallic alpha. For the normal map, pop it in here. Sometimes it comes up with an error. Just click fix now, and then drag this on, and there we go. In sheer beauty. We've got our material in Unity. You can see that varied roughness on the surface is kind of catching the light, the edges and the cavities, just adding a little bit of detail. Yeah. And as you can see, it's simple, but it looks quite nice. And I guess that's what we're aiming for our project. That's pretty much it. You know, you can apply the same principles to any of the assets we make, really. Um, yeah, and I'll make a little documentation just saying which brushes I would recommend. We didn't really cover it earlier, but some of the best sculptors in ZBrush say you're meant to be doing as much as you can with as few brushes as possible, you know, and using the same or similar brushes will help to create a kind of cohesive style throughout the whole project. Brilliant. Well, I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions, let me know. We ran a bit over schedule, but I think it's worth getting this thing done now just to avoid confusion at a later date. So thank you very much. See you soon. Okay, so here we are, finally in Substance Painter. As you can see, we have our, oopsie, our low poly model with the hard edges, soft edges, nice UVs, and excellent naming systems. As you can see, material.001. Let's actually rename that because it's going to be pretty important when we get to, you know, file management. If we have a billion materials named material 001, well, that's just going to be shit. So we'll call this tutorial obelisk. Brilliant. And baking time. So just go to bake mesh maps, find the high poly. There we are. We don't need average normals or ignore back faces. I like to turn off diffusion just because I think it looks. I don't really think it adds anything. And so for the normal, let's just give it a test bake. Make sure it's working. Oh, here we go. Huh.